is sponsored by Bank of America, our sponsor, and it's my pleasure to introduce Claudia Dulac from Bank of America. Please.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. We're so happy to be here with you today to cover such an important topic, building it in, living your organization's DEI values from the inside out. At Bank of America, we are a longtime partner and supporter of the Center for Nonprofits, including this conference, for, as I was reminded this morning, for over a decade. The tools and resources and support and advocacy that the Center for Nonprofits provides to nonprofits in New Jersey is instrumental. And at Bank of America, we're committed to diversity and inclusion to help our company be a great place to work. The diversity of our employees' race, national origin, religion, age, gender identity, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, ethnicity, disabilities, and veteran status make us stronger, and it's essential to our ability to serve our clients, fulfill our purpose, and drive responsible growth. So it's an absolute pleasure to kick this off this morning. And I have the honor of turning it over to our two presenters, Mikeala Levons, trustee of Young Audiences, New Jersey and Eastern Pennsylvania, and Joseph Ahmed, artist service manager and diversity, equity, and inclusion access manager for Young Audiences of New Jersey and Eastern Pennsylvania. So I am proud to turn it over to Mikeala and Joseph.
Thank you, Claudia. Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all coming on in. Before we even introduce ourselves formally, because we're a morning session, we want to warm you up with an icebreaker. So we're talking about DEIA, or whatever alphabetical acronym you might use. And the question we had was, when you think about these terms, diversity, equity, inclusion, access, some people have justice, belonging, etc., what kind of weather do you feel like when you think about how your organization thinks about it? So for example, if I think about the way my organization handles DEIA, I might say it's like a sunny beach, and every now and again, there's some turbulent waters that rush onto the shore. So if you can put that in the chat, what weather do you think of when you think about your organization's relationship to DEIA? And there are no wrong answers. As y'all are typing too, I see some folks I know. I see Margene in the room. I see Yvette in the room. Hi, Allison, long time no see. Aww. All right, Lisa says it's foggy. Debbie says windy and partly sunny. I like that. And foggy, I think, is gonna be common. Let's see. All right, we have sunny with some rain. Oh, okay. Oh, nice. Yes, Joe. Blue sky, some occasional stormy clouds. Fair, very fair. Let's see. Okay. Partly sunny, sun breaking through. This sounds like real forecast, you guys. Bright sun, some behind the clouds. Oh, I like that. A lovely sunny day until there's some winds. Little cloudy, sun is breaking through. I see a lot of sunshine. I'm not seeing anybody saying like torrential downpour, thunderstorms, awful. Cool. Windy with some turbulence. All right. Okay. We'll talk through some really concrete ways that you can kind of shift the weather, if you will. So what I'm going to do now, feel free to continue putting it into the chat because I do think it's fun, but we're going to introduce ourselves just so you know who all we are and then get started and share some slides. So I'll invite Joe to actually share our slides now so you can see some visuals as we chat. And just to confirm, we're in Building It In, Living Your Organization's DEI Values from the Inside Out. So as I said earlier, my name is Mikeala Levons, and in my day job, I'm actually the Director of Donor Relations at an organization called Equal Justice USA. So we're a national organization, we all work remotely, and we are trying to create solutions to violence that move us away from over-policing, mass incarceration, and the death penalty. You can look us up online if you wish, but today, I am wearing my hat as a trustee of Young Audiences, New Jersey and Eastern Pennsylvania. I'm very proud to be in that role. I jumped in 2020, I think. Heather, when did we join? I don't know. It feels like it's been a long time because it's like really intense and really important work. So I enjoy it. Joe, over to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm so excited to chat with all of you. My name is Joseph Ahmed. I use he and they pronouns interchangeably. You can also call me Joseph or Joe. I go by either. And I am the Artist Services Manager and also Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Access Manager at Young Audiences, New Jersey and Eastern Pennsylvania, where I have been for around 4 years now. It began in 2018. So other background about me, I am a teaching artist and a performing artist in circus and dance and theater. I am also currently, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but I'm currently in the process of securing a certified diversity professional accreditation, which is part of where the learning in this session comes from. I am originally a New Jersey native and currently live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, both of which are on the land of the Lenni Lenape.
Thank you, Joe. And yeah, I would also just reiterate that I am not a performing artist, but I did do a fair amount of dancing in church when I was a kid. It was very bad, but very fun. It gave me a long appreciation for the arts. I also want to name that I'm here in Central Jersey, where I'm zooming in from, also the land of the Lenni Lenape. So in terms of what we're doing today, where are we going with this discussion? We really want to set out for you just what Young Audiences has been doing with matters of DEIA and use our work as an example. At Young Audiences, we'll talk about this more, but we intentionally use this acronym. It's the diversity, equity, inclusion, and access is an important one that we have added. So we're gonna break down what those things mean. Joe is gonna kind of lead us through, and then we're gonna go back and forth to learning about how we do it in our programmatic work, how we do it on the board. And we really wanna leave some time for question and answer. So get your questions ready. And if you put them in Hoover, we'll also try and catch them there.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Mikeala. So just to talk really quickly about Young Audiences, we'll get a little bit more deeper into our mission and values later. But just so you know, Young Audiences of New Jersey and Eastern Pennsylvania is an art education organization. We're the largest one in our region of New Jersey and the 7 easternmost counties of Pennsylvania. We bring arts education opportunities to students, primarily working in schools K through 12. Just so you have a little background of where we're coming from as we start to get into this. So getting into the alphabet soup, so fun. So for this work, likely your organization uses some variety of these letters. I'm talking about the particular ones that we use here at Young Audiences. I think it's important to not get too lost in the soup of exactly which words we're using, but it is important to define what we're talking about so that we're not just using buzzwords. So what I'll be sharing here is some of the definitions that we particularly use at Young Audiences. Most of these came to us through our initial strategic consultation with Lisa Yancey Consulting. Diversity. The state or fact of being different, unlike, and varied. Diversity is relevant in DEI conversations when a person's or group's unique differences inform different treatment in society. During my CDP training, someone used a really great example of just imagining a room, right, a conference room, and diversity is who is in the room, right? Who is just literally, what are the different people who are inside of that room? Getting my slides to work here. Equity. The quality of fair, impartial, and just. For DEI, equity takes into account that people have different access to resources because of systems of oppression and privilege. Equity seeks to balance that disparity. So this is really thinking about who has power in that conference room, right? Who has the ability to make decisions, and do folks have what they need to be participating and have their voices heard in those conversations. Inclusion, the state of being a part of the whole, enclosed, contained. In DEI conversations, inclusion acknowledges the need for diverse perspectives and engagement. So this to me is really that deeper level. I think belonging is also used in this acronym a lot, and these to me feel related of not just is someone in the room, what's the amount of power they have, but really how included in the culture of the organization and its decision-making are they. And finally, access, the freedom or ability to obtain or make use of something. In DEI spaces, this refers to a commitment to foster attitudes, behaviors, and procedures to facilitate access that promotes equity and diversity, right? If someone cannot get into the conference room, it is hard for them to have a voice at the table and feel included in the culture. So this encompasses general accessibility questions, as well as broader questions thinking about different languages that are spoken, et cetera. And I'll pass it back to Mikeala for a moment to get a little bit deeper into talking about our mission and vision as we get a little bit more into how we apply these concepts to organizations.
Thanks, Joe. So as Joe mentioned, young audiences, like to ground us in exactly what this particular nonprofit does. Our mission is to inspire young people and to expand their learning through the arts. Our vision is working toward a future where all children in our region, which is New Jersey and Eastern Pennsylvania for us, engage in quality arts learning that nurtures creativity, expands cultural awareness, and fosters the development of critical thinking skills. So that's the lens that we're bringing to this DEIA work. We're trying to figure out how do we do that while incorporating DEIA or using that as a filter through which we're doing the work. And a brief history, which I actually didn't even discover until we had this board retreat. I didn't realize that Young Audiences started in 1973. It actually was the region, or still the region's largest arts education organization. And the work actually used to focus on bringing classical music to kids. If you were to look at Young Audiences website now, I don't even think you would realize that that was the inception, because right now we're focused on doing so many different types of cultural exposures, art forms, etc. And of course, as Joe mentioned, we are a part of an affiliate network, and there are 31 different affiliates in this group. So hopefully our slides, when we share them, just so you all know, there's a black bar that shows up because of just a Zoom interaction or interface. So just be patient. We're going to try upload them afterwards to Hoover.
So to get a little bit more into how this all connects to DEIA. So generally the question is, why is DEIA important, right? Many of the people on this call might be like, of course it's important. We already believe in this as a something we're doing. I do think that it's very important to come back to this, because there are folks who are like, I actually don't see the reason for this in our organization. What is actually the, beyond sort of like soft metrics, the reason for incorporating this? And there's a few different layers of that, right? So coming back to young audiences in our history, right? Our mission is to inspire young people and expand their learning through the arts. There's nothing specifically connected to DEIA in that mission. However, as you can see, this other little bit of text here, this is from our Arts United statement. We'll get a little bit more into what Arts United is a little bit later. YA continually strives to create spaces that are diverse, equitable, and inclusive to all students. YA is committed to providing students of all identities, backgrounds, and experiences with arts education. So you can see that enshrined in our values, deeper than that mission, we're seeing that it's really important for us to think about, when we say inspire young people, we really mean all young people. We're really trying to make that the most expansive definition as possible. So we can see for an organization, they might have the need for equity inclusion built in to their mission. It might be something that's enshrined in the values of the people in the organization or the expressed values of the organization. And it might be that there is a business case, which is true for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is a part of the training I've been doing for the certified diversity professional. I've been working with the Institute for Diversity Certification. So many words, apologies. So the business case, right? Fundamentally, diversity, equity, and inclusion not just supports this sort of soft feeling of like everyone is included and that's wonderful and great, but it also supports business. So this can mean many different things, right, in corporate contexts versus in nonprofit contexts. But fundamentally, and we've seen this in young audiences, when we are being more inclusive, business is better, right? We work in a very diverse region, New Jersey and Eastern Pennsylvania. So when we are catering to the diverse experiences of that region, when we are matching the demographics of our region, the responses from our school partners are better, the experiences of all of our stakeholders are better. There's a business case that this is important and it makes our business stronger. So to get a little bit into the history of this organization and how it's related to diversity, equity, inclusion. Young Audiences, as we talked about, has been around since 1973. I'm speaking about this as someone who's been here for 4 years, so some of this history is not something that I've participated in, but that I've heard about and I'm communicating. Young Audiences has, for its history, been a predominantly white organization. This has been shifting over the last few years, and there's a few key things that have gone into shifting both the demographics of the organization and how we're incorporating DEI. What we'll be talking about is new leadership, our diversity plan, and then sort of seeing where that's taken us over the last few years. So in 2015, Michelle Russo became our new president and CEO. And with her, she brought a focus on DEIA as a core value of the organization. We'll talk a little bit later about how important buy-in from leadership is. This is really what kickstarted this work. Following that, we worked with Lisa Yancey of Yancey Consulting, originally for a one-day training, and then later for a more extended period to create a 3-year plan for diversity, equity, inclusion. You can see Lisa Yancey here, very fabulous person, highly recommended. And also I just included the words Arts United here because that is the name that we've given to this branch of our work. So if you hear me say Arts United, that is me referring specifically to Young Audiences' diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So following that plan, over the last 3 years, we have been maintaining this plan, tracking it, following up on the actions it recommended. And so you can see here a sort of a scatter plot of a number of actions that have happened over the course of this time. I won't read through all of these. This is also just a small snapshot of what has happened. From the place where we begin, we have had dramatically shifted demographics for our staff, for the teaching artists we work with, as well as for our board. We have created dedicated committees in both staff and board. As you can see from me being here, there is a dedicated DEIA manager position. We have a dedicated budget line. We have continuing professional learning for all stakeholder groups. There's a lot that is happening. All of this to say, we still have places to go, right? Every organization still has places they can grow with this, but there is a lot that we've done in the last year. And so part of what we're sharing today is both our learnings so far and where we feel like we are still growing and where we can hopefully encourage you to also be growing as well. Our strengths, there are a few things that have really helped us in this goal. The first thing is cross-departmental integration. One of the things that we got from Lisa Yancey is a very detailed plan across different departments, different aspects of the organization, detailing across each year what goals we want to achieve, right? And then over this time, part of my job has been tracking this document, working with each department in the organization to see if we're following up on those goals, to see what actions have been taken that moves us toward those, and whether we're achieving each goal. Buy-in from leadership. This is really key, and we're really lucky in that we started our journey from a place of knowing that our leadership was not just involved, but was really helping jumpstart this work. We have dedicated staff position and committees. So apart from just integrating across the departments, we also have folks who what they are doing with the organization is really focusing on this work. This is part of my job on the staff side, part of Mikeala's job on the board side. Data analysis. We're still figuring out our relationship to this, but we have been doing a lot of looking at our demographics, of analyzing the data of our staff, of our artists, of our vendors for diversity in order to figure out where we are as a baseline and where we need to go. And finally, budget allocation. We have been putting money towards this, both in a flexible, specifically Arts United budget, as well as towards specific projects and initiatives. A tool that I would like to introduce you to, and I'm going to take a little bit more time with this because I think it's a really useful thing. This comes from my training with the Institute for Diversity Certification. This is the Diversity Development Continuum, yay, the DDC, if you will. So I have another screen over here, so if you see me looking away, that's what's happening. So I'm just going to go briefly through sort of what we're talking about when we look at these different categories. I'm going to move this bar out of the way, so hopefully this is less in the way of you seeing this. So in case this is a little small for you to see, you can see that we have a scale here that goes from 0 to 100, and it moves from compliant at 0 through conventional to purposeful, over to competent, and then finally to advanced. So this is the scale that we're talking about. And this is a tool that I found very useful in thinking about where we are and where we need to go next as an organization in this work. So some brief definitions of sort of what we're talking about in each of these categories. So a compliant organization is an organization that's following EEO laws, right? Not doing anything illegal, but is not doing anything related to diversity, equity, inclusion, right? That is not a journey they've started. That is not an expressed goal or initiative happening at the organization. Once we get to conventional, we start to see basic diversity training. We start to see perhaps a one-page, a very small but achievable diversity plan, maybe an initial climate and culture analysis. This is very like baby steps, just starting that journey. Once we get to purposeful, we see an organization that is really understanding the need to implement diversity, equity, inclusion, right? This is becoming a value of the organization. It's understood this needs to be more than like a training on how people are diverse, right? We're looking a little bit deeper. So when we get here, we see a few other things. We see leadership buy-in, right? Another strength of YA. We were able to jump into this step by having Michelle already really invested, Michelle and the leaders of our organization. We see a multifaceted diversity plan with a lot of different layers to it. We see at least one annual report about what's been happening during that year, but this is still mostly soft data, right? We're not necessarily doing really deep data analysis on what's happening. When we get to competent, we start to see more detailed diversity goals. Maybe we're looking at supplier diversity, pay adjustments, things like that. And this is really when we start to see hard data, right? We're really measuring baseline, setting achievable goals, and seeing if we've moved towards those goals and shifting strategy. When we get to advanced, we're really looking at more larger, more complex initiatives. Perhaps we're entering new markets. Maybe we're translating our website into 3 different languages all at the same time. We're doing these much more complex things. And it's really understood across the board that diversity, equity, inclusion is both a value of the organization and also fundamental to business and to business continuing. So to place ourselves briefly, your young audiences currently, I believe, live sort of in the realm between purposeful and competent. We are still in a place of figuring out and solidifying exactly what our approach to data analysis is, and as an annual practice, how we want to be doing that, which I think is the main thing that we're working on in moving towards really being in that competent category. But some of the things that are happening in competent, we do see that we're already doing, right? We're looking at vendor diversity already. We're doing a few things that put us past that purposeful mark. And then this really helps us place what do we need to do to solidify ourselves as competent and really get into this next level advanced category. One other thing I'll share here before we get into another section. So this is the system change wheel. This is a tool shared with YA by the teaching artist Josh Campbell, who worked on an anti-racism programming initiative that we're currently doing. So this talks about our understanding and relationship to diverse cultures in terms of a circle, right? So we have cultural humility, which is accepting and understanding what you don't know. Cultural competency, which is a basic ability to communicate, to understand, to interact. And then cultural responsiveness really being a deep understanding of not just how to communicate, but of the strengths of other cultures besides yours, how to uplift those based on their strengths. The reason that I bring this up is that I think that thinking of this work as a wheel is actually really useful. While I find that Continuum an effective tool, I do think it could be a little reductive, right? Fundamentally, when we're thinking about people being included, right? While there is a linear scale that we can follow in terms of our organizational efforts, it's important to remember that this is difficult and sometimes uncomfortable work. And there is a feedback loop, there is a cyclical nature to it that is important to understand, right? Sometimes you get to that place where you're feeling like you're really doing well, and then you realize you made a faux pas, you need to step back into cultural humility and realize that there's more work you need to do to come back around that circle, and that's okay. Okay, I'm gonna take a breath and sip some water, and then we're gonna get into this case study.
Hey, thank you, Joe. I am learning so much. And while you were talking, my Zoom froze and I popped up a whole new computer. So how's that for being tech savvy?
I saw you enter the waiting room and I was like, oh, the second Mikeala's here.
I know, ooh, hunting the space. Go right ahead.
Okay. So one of the main things that we're gonna do today, sort of in my section before I pass it to Mikeala, is I thought it would be really useful. We've talked a little bit about some of the tools that we use to track where we're at in relationship to diversity, equity, inclusion, what has set us up for success. But I want to look at one of our initiatives through sort of an intersectional lens to see how these cross-departmental efforts have affected the students we work with, right? Have really affected one clear initiative. So we're doing a case study on our Arts Impact Initiative, which serves Trenton. So a little bit about this initiative. So in the mid-2000s, most of the arts funding to Trenton schools was cut. During that time, Young Audiences of New Jersey created the Adopt a School program, which provided free arts programming to schools, mainly focusing on elementary and some middle schools in that area. The number of schools we have, the number of funders supporting this has expanded over the years. The scope of the program has expanded. Then during these last several years of working through our DEI, our Arts United strategic plan, we've seen a number of changes that have shaken up this initiative and really transformed it into something that's much more exciting through that lens. So I'm going to talk about a few of those changes that have happened as part of our strategic initiatives and how those have specifically affected the Arts Impact Initiative. You'll notice I've used two names for this. We'll get into that in a second. So the first thing that happened was beginning with myself and then Lindsay Roberts, we began to have arts administrators of color working in this predominantly Black and Latinx area. Asha Bryant, who is now in that position, is also a person of color. This is really important because that is a predominantly Black and Latinx area, right? So we had folks working in those schools who more represent the demographics that are present there. Marketing. So why these two names, right? One of the things that Lindsay did in her role as the administrator of Adopt a School is think a little bit about that name, right? What you'll see on the left here is an image very similar to something that Lindsay showed us in a staff meeting, which is when you Google adoption, what do you see? A lot of what you see is white parents with brown and Black children, right? There's this white savior complex that comes with it, right? There's this internally kind of condescending and patronizing tone in just that title, right? In the framing of it. And so what Lindsay led us in was a rebrand into the Arts Impact Initiative, which you can see below. The goal of this really being, instead of us providing this free thing to people in need, really understanding there is a genius to this community, right? We are making an impact, but fundamentally we're not talking down to this community. We are partnering with them and we want to uplift their goals and help them move towards them through that partnership. Some of the things that we've seen that helped here are artist engagement and continued education. So I'll give you a short example of, at one point in one of the schools that we were working with, we had an instance of one of our artist groups that went into there. We have a number of artists who work with us as independent contractors. That's our relationship with them. There was a moment where they shushed an audience in a way that was not taken well by the staff of the school who reported this incident to us. We had some conversations with them. We then later, we were like, okay, this seems to be smoothed over. Later during a meeting, an artist call that we had with one of our artists, we had a moment of them using language that was not in line with our diversity, equity, and inclusion values. And so we had a moment there where we realized, right, actually this artist group is not matching the values of our organization. We think that we need to end our relationship with this artist group. This was really important because this perspective has enabled us to start to shift the roster of who we're working with to people who can really provide culturally responsive experiences, right? Where we're not getting back that negative feedback that is damaging our business and not having those moments that are reinforcing negative things for the students in the schools we're serving. And as a follow-up to this incident, we had a meeting as a staff where we created training where we shared the video of what had happened, the words that had been shared in that artist call, asked the staff to go into breakout groups and talk about, oh, if you were the person sort of leading this meeting, how would you have responded to this moment in real time? And then we came back and we watched the end of the video to see how that, that encounter played out. So we used this moment of a moment of bias arising as a teachable moment to help train the staff on how to deal with things like this that happen in the future. Curriculum updates. So as part of what we've been doing Arts United audits of teaching artist programs, right? So we've been seeing a lot of programs. This has been a little bit easier in the virtual sphere since the pandemic. And we've really been able to respond to both marketing copy as well as to the actual content of a program to help guide artists in making their programs more culturally responsive, in avoiding appropriation, et cetera. You can see here on the right, there's, that's my sort of derpy face there, in a conversation conversation with Mary Kanish, who is one of our teaching artists, who came to us to talk about how she could really move towards positive representation of cultures in her multicultural music program. We also began to update curriculum for some of our more standardized programs. For instance, Dodge Theater to Learn. This is a program in partnership with the Dodge Foundation, which serves a number of different schools. Some of them have been in the Trenton area. We began revising things like the professional learning offered to teachers here, right? To focus more on culturally responsive ideas, on understanding diverse gender identities in the classroom, et cetera. This is a program that does a long-term residency with a class of students moving over 4 years. And so we also recently revised one of the scripts that we use to be multilingual, to include multiple gender identities, multiple family structures, to really focus on having a script that students can use that is a lot more inclusive and closer to their own experience and culture. Program development. I talked about this a little bit, but one of our new initiatives is called the Anti-Racism Programming Initiative. We began this last year and are piloting it this year, one of them being in Trenton School. So this is focused on communicating principles of anti-racism and fundamentally uplifting Black joy and art-making traditions. So you can see here a number of the consultants over on the left, Dr. Yolanda Celia Ruiz and Josh Campbell, who I had mentioned, who worked on this, as well as a number of the artists who are involved, Janine Osayande, Eric James Montgomery, Soul Defined, and Summer Dawn, some of whom I'll talk about a little bit later. And finally, policy integration. So one of the things that we're doing that was inspired by some of these incidents that happened and has allowed us to move forward conversations with our artists is we've encoded these values into our agreements and into our policy. The first thing you can see on the right is our cultural representation and appropriation policy, which I led creating a couple of years ago and has adapted as we've moved on. So this defines cultural appropriation. It makes clear what YA's stance is on it, and it makes clear sort of how we move through working out these issues with artists so that we have a really clear and standardized approach to this. Every artist gets a copy of this as they sign their yearly artist agreement with us. Speaking of that artist agreement, so this is the contract we have with our artists that they sign yearly. And so down at the bottom, you can see some language that comes from this, where specifically we make it clear that part of this agreement is that folks are supporting the DEI values of the organization. And if there are severe breaches of that policy, we have the right to terminate that contract, right? We're really putting a little bit of force behind this because it is that important to our organization. Okay, so I'm gonna pause there. That was a lot. I'll take a sip of water and pass it over to Mikeala. I've been talking a lot about sort of our staff-driven initiatives, and Mikeala's gonna talk to you about what this has looked like on the trustee and board side of the equation.
Thank you, Joe. And I'm seeing so many good questions. And I just want to say and reiterate, as Debbie said earlier, if you put things in Hoover, they will outlive this Zoom session, but we are going to get you the recording of this session and a deck. Even if we need to email it, you'll definitely have it, everyone that was in this session. So to trustees, background, the pandemic has it so murky. I think it was 2020, but essentially the reason I'm forgetting is because we hit the ground running. So imagine it's like racial unrest. There's a pandemic. Of course, artists, the people that we partner with, were hit very, very hard. And I remember probably one of my first trustee meetings, the discussion was around how do we equitably support the teaching artists? And of course, our business model is we sell programming to schools. If schools are closed, guess what? We're in trouble. And so there's all this tension, and somebody raises the point that it is an utmost priority that we support teaching artists. And this looks like paying people their contracts, even though there's no programming going on. And to me, that was super inspiring. And that's why I joined our Arts United committee, because it was a firm example of being committed to true equity. Like, you are not going to just look at folks as dollars and cents. You know that people are hurting, and so you're going to support them. And the board supported that decision. So that's just out the gate, an early example of the lens and how it plays out in the board. But in terms of the background, so in our 2019 strategic planning process, which, as Joe mentioned, a lot of this is before our time, but we have to learn it as we come on the board. And we're still in the process of living out that 3-year plan. We're in the last year. The board asked, how does YA make good on the promise to reach every child? You heard me say that was part of our vision, right? So in addition to the programmatic shifts, it became imperative that the board itself start embodying DEIA values. And, Joe mentioned before, when we say that we were a mostly white organization, we mean that also on our board. Older, I would say, skewed trustees, and perhaps a lot of folks who are in education and the arts, but perhaps socioeconomically also kind of similar. There is a lot of similarity, a lot of homogeneity, as is the case with many boards. So in any case, that was the big elephant in the room, right? Like, how do we get this board on board with all of this? Pun intended. So we saw Lisa Yancey earlier, and she did this very thorough DEI training. And as I said, after that training, I think YA added the A to our acronyms, but there was work. And I want to emphasize that this doesn't happen by reading an article or doing a social media, blackout campaign or something like that. It meant people taking time out of their day to go through a very uncomfortable, potentially consultation process. Lisa doesn't hold back. If you were able to go to like anything she's done with the Dodge Foundation, she will hit you with the truth and she'll let you sit in it. And so folks were doing both organizational work, like what does it mean at YA to define our language around DEIA, but also internal work. And that's hard. I just said we had a lot of older white folks. Like, that's a tough thing to do when you've been living your life feeling that you are an equitable and liberal person, to be confronting with truth. I can tell you that people did their work and really started digging into, for example, what does it mean when we talk about equity having 3 layers? So at Young Audiences, we talk about it meaning our personal beliefs and values. There's institutional equity, which has to do with policies, leadership, representation. And then there's structural. And those are system-wide policies. We exist in a school system, which we all know is fraught with inequity. How do we grapple with that? We talked about just the importance of distinguishing inclusion from assimilation. It's very important that we're not asking kids to conform to what we believe an arts-educated child should look like. I think another example, just very practically, was if we want to bring this into our board recruitment, what will it look like to have diverse board members? So, I mean, I'm very proud to be 39. I can't wait to be 40. So I'm a mom. I have 3 babies. They're not super young anymore. I'm married. I'm a mid-career nonprofit professional. How do you recruit someone like me to join your board? Well, I started on board and we had these mid-morning meetings all the time. And I was like, I'm at work. Or it would be like late in the evening. I have to put my kids to bed. So something as simple as, what does equity look like and diversity look like just in the timing of your meetings? When you can no longer assume all your trustees are retired folks or folks who have, a power placement that gives them ultimate flexibility. And so folks were willing to really go through, sometimes it's a pain in the butt, but the process of polling, just that simple process of opening up what the calendar will look like for your trustees signals that you're serious about truly having diverse stakeholders in that group. The other thing that I found powerful is Joe mentioned the working language guide. That was created in February 2020, just before I joined. And it's something that was a part of our onboarding packet. So for example, you'll hear us saying things like, these are my pronouns, or I'm on a particular land that was, taken from Native American folks. Like, you may come into the board at YA or anywhere and just be like, what's going on? And you may want to say, Joe, can I take an hour of your time so you can just school me on all the things? Well, no, because we have a document that you can reference. So it's up to us. The onus is on the trustee at YA to do the work of reading and understanding. For example, one of my favorite distinctions in our language guide is something I personally use, so it's beneficial to me, like in my work, asset-based language. Like, what we're trying to do is not describe, for example, a program saying this program reduces chronic absenteeism. Instead, from an asset-based approach, YA would say the program engaged students in school. The program increased attendance. You see the difference? And that is something that is subtle, but is super important if you're going to be consistent with your values throughout your language. I think that I really enjoy seeing our staff model it. So with YA, our staff will come and present reports from time to time. And we have like our director of curriculum instruction and assessment, who I got to learn from this week. And I really think her voice is so soothing and so nice. But she will model for us For example, introducing yourself in a Zoom room where you know there may be some accessibility challenges. You might say, hi, my name is Mikeala. I have short hair. I'm wearing a peach-colored shirt. I am a medium brown skinned African-American, Jamaican woman, et cetera, et cetera. Those subtle things sometimes are better caught than taught. And so part of the role of the YA staff is also to model for us, like how they actually do it in their work. I found it to be exceptionally just instructive. And then, for example, complex concepts like intersectionality. If Joe's given a report and says intersectionality, I know I can look back at this document that's been codified with YA and understand what that means. And then I have a whole cadre of folks who can also give me more resources. Part of that is the work of what we call our Arts United Committee. So I see my co-conspirator, Heather Barberi, in the room. We are now co-chairs for that committee this year. It is awesome work. And we have to give props to our predecessor, Barbara Moran, who was, I guess, the inaugural chair, huh? Barbara laid a lot of groundwork, and Barbara really gave us a precedent of how the work is done by saying, you're going to push limits. You're going to be embedding principles in all the committees that are within this board. YA structure is that we have several very intensely working committees. It's not like a sit and look pretty board by any stretch. So we have our committee on trustees. Those are the folks that recruit board members. Well, I just told you some of the important factors to consider. And so our committee is always liaising with them saying, what does diversity look like when you're recruiting? I think in our 2.0 segment of the work, we're asking, what does diversity look like in board leadership? So you can be a trustee, but if you are not necessarily a board chair or you're not on the exec committee, that also impacts the amount of influence you will have. And so how do we ensure that folks that embody all the diversities that are significant to us at YA or at your particular organization are funneled into that leadership structure? So we ask those tough questions. For example, you'll see that I'm fairly new, Heather's fairly new. We're teaming up and partnering to lead a committee. So I don't feel like I'm the only one and the Black woman has to tell everybody about all the things. Like that is not the weirdness that I experience. And we frankly talk about that and we name that. And so we come up with a solution. I think another significant element of our work is intersecting with our finance committee. So we started talking about what does it mean to be embodying our principles throughout? Well, we have small investments. Where are those funds invested? Where are those banks using our money? And are they equitable? And so our finance committee, when we asked that question, acted so quickly. They have already sent letters out to, I think it's 6 different institutions that we use. And they've gotten probably 3 letters stating what the equity practices are. And they're going to be analyzing them, and then we're holding them accountable. They have to come back and tell us what they found. And so those kind of practical, applications are really how we want to at least learn. Like, I don't know what's going to come of that. Are we going to pull our funds and so forth because of fossil fuels? I don't know. But at least we're going to start having the conversation and ask the question, right? Another way that I think the work is really embedded is in we have a committee on education. And so when we talk about that, we discuss what does it look like in New Jersey in particular, and Eastern Pennsylvania, but we have a lot of New Jersey folks. What does it look like when we hear about this notion of critical race theory? So we discussed it with our Arts United work. And then we transitioned over to what does it look like in the education sector? And we had some good debate. Some folks were like, well, it's not that big a deal in New Jersey. And then when we talked to our colleagues who actually work with superintendents and principals, they were like, oh, but it is. Oh, yes, yes, yes. And so we are already talking about how do we express our work and talk about YA's value add in a context where parents and administrators might be hearing that, you're trying to preach critical race theory to my child. And so we came up with a strategy that really focuses on what we are adding to the mix in terms of our culturally responsive arts education lens and our social emotional learning lens. And we're not going to go battle out CRT, but we are going to be informed by what's happening culturally in the way we present our work. So I think those are some really key examples that I wanted to make sure I shared. Note any questions you might have. I will just tell you briefly too, and I know I'm jumping around slide-wise, Joe, sorry. I wanted to tell you another practical example of what board learning looks like. that's also evolved. So in 2019, and it's funny because I was delving into the notes. We take really good notes at Young Audiences, in part because Joe was taking them. So thank you, Joe. But I could see that our board was deciding, like, what does continued learning look like? And so we had the Lisa Yancey sessions, and then we decided, let's read a book. So that's just about when I joined. We decided to read Stamped by Ibram X. Kendi. Anybody seen Stamped? You can raise your hand if you're on camera. But it's a big book, you guys. It's long. And so we decided it would be a summer read, and we tried to make it accessible. So we said, if you are able to read the young adult version of the book, then that's fine too, because you'll get the basic principles. But then I joined the Arts United committee, and each of us took a list of trustees. The board hovers between 25 and 30 maybe. And so we each called a few people and one-on-one debriefed with how they felt the book kind of sat with them personally, and how their personal work kind of was affected by the learnings in the book. And then we came together and we had some group discussion. So that was like some really intensive, kind of an extension of personal work that we were doing. But then we started moving into, okay, how does this personal conviction impact the actual work that Young Audiences does? So we all had to get well-versed on what culturally responsive arts education is. I mentioned that earlier. And as I said, I don't come from an education background. So I was like, I don't know what that means. That just sounds like a bunch of mumbo jumbo, but we had to learn it. And when we sat and started going through things like, Dodge Foundation had several awesome resources for learning. Several of us opted into Dodge and Yancey partnering to do an intensive kind of learning experience. It was learning to applied practice for anti-racism and anti-oppression. And we had a curriculum, we had readings, and we had sessions, and we had to tell our employer, like, hey, I'm going to take time to do this thing during work hours. All of that culminated in us coming back together as a board to discuss, okay, what next? How are we going to move the work forward next? So it's been a really fruitful experience. It's led to things like, for example, when you talk about recruiting trustees, we have, I don't know if it's for the first time, Joe or Michelle or Ann can tell me, but we have a school principal on our board now. And it's awesome. This particular principal, her name is Adrienne Hill. She's a woman of color, a Black woman, and she's partnered with the community for years. So we have been in her school. She's at Hedgepeth in Trenton. And she's seen our work as kind of the recipient or principal. And now she's going to be on our board of trustees, or she is. And she has this very unique and useful and really fundamental perspective to our work. So we have enjoyed that, and we're trying to think about how do we get more of our community stakeholders to join our boards. And I'll name the funky stuff. We all know about that weirdness. It's like, oh, the give get. We need to have people who can give us money, Mikeala. Look, we can't. And that's a real concern. And I encourage you to broach that with whether you have a committee on trustees or whoever it is in your world that decides on board members. Talk about that. What does it look like to want younger people or to want people of economic diversity on the board when you're expecting them to bring tons and tons of money? And maybe you need to reframe what the expectation is. Maybe you need to get creative with that. So with that, I will leave the rest for Q&A time, but I wanted to hand over to Joe just to kind of wrap us up with the next steps for YA, because we have more work to do.
Totally. Thanks, Mikeala. Yeah, and I think we're actually doing we talked so fast. I talked so fast. So we're doing really good on time, which is wonderful. So I think I'm going to open this sort of next steps category up to you as well, because I'm very curious about your thoughts on here if you want to share any. But, I think something that's so important to me in this session, right, is that while we are, up here as the presenters and coming from this place of expertise, really understanding that this is still a relatively new journey for young audiences. And there's always still somewhere that we need to go. And I think that's true for every organization in different ways, right? So we're at this place where we've seen over the last couple of years, right, with the uprisings that happened around the death of George Floyd a few years ago, a lot of organizations sort of got woken up to the need for inclusion work, the need for anti-racism in a way that they hadn't been before. And I think that it's something that even in my encounters with other different organizations, when I see someone who's like, and in 2020 that was when you sort of got hip to this work, I have some questions. I'm like, really, how deep is this in what your organization is doing? One of the things that has been really wonderful about working with young audiences is that this work started back in 2018 or even a little earlier with Michelle. So knowing that we have a little bit of that through line, but I think one of the questions that we're asking ourselves now, as I think a lot of organizations are, is like, okay, we've had this first strategic plan, right? We've had this first blush of work. What does this mean now, right? So right now we're looking at reassessing our strategic goals for the next few years, thinking about all of this work we've done, all of this learning with Lisa Yancey in learning to applied practice, which was mentioned by Mikeala. How are we leveraging this to really figure out smartly and strategically during a global pandemic, how are we moving this work forward in the next few years? Part of what we talked about, coming back to that diversity development continuum, which I feel is a really useful tool, is thinking about, okay, we've done a lot of action, right? Now that we've done a lot of action, how can we get even better about setting goals, taking baseline measurements, and then taking measurements at the end to see whether we've achieved those goals, right? How can we really work measurable goals and measuring those things into an annual practice is something we're talking about. And then continuing to challenge our assumptions, right? And ask hard questions, continuing to be like, even in being this position of sharing out, right? At a nonprofit conference, how are we also continuing to hold ourselves accountable? How are we always looking back at what the dynamics of our office are, at how we're paying people, at what are the things that we assume and take for granted about our practices that maybe aren't as equitable as we think they are, or maybe in a few years we'll realize, oh, actually there's a new best practice out there in the world that we need to be thinking about. We need to keep with the times and keep moving forward. Mikeala, is there anything that you'd like to share here about what you see as next steps for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when it comes to measurement, it's so funny. Literally this week, we got into this really good discussion about some goals that we're revising for our Arts United committee. And it was great because the question was raised. We have this objective of, I think, prioritize budget for DEIA. And someone said, oh, that sounds great. How are we measuring that? And it was like, well, we have some ways that we think we're measuring, but that's a good question. So we're going to take that back and delve more deeply into what does it look like to measure. It can't be that I check a box because I felt like it gave me a warm fuzzy and I moved on. And the truth is that we actually have been doing some measurement of those things. Like we have budget line items like Joe mentioned, but we want to do even more. And it takes time and it takes money and effort. Somebody's time has to be spent measuring that. The other thing I wanted to mention too, Joe, was as a nonprofit professional myself, someone who's a center staff emerita, is that it, Debbie? Worked at the center back in the day. But I think it's important to talk about compensation. And I think that's something that those with power, say a trustee or someone in leadership, should keep front of mind. Doesn't mean that you can pay everybody what they're really, deserving of in the corporate sense, but it's worth having the discussion about what does it look like to pay people equitably? Do we need to be transparent about salary? Maybe we don't want to do that, but maybe like where I work currently, we have transparency around bands of salary. So like for every kind of band of people, what the range is, and when colleagues are hired, what they're gonna be in the range of, So some transparency there can be good. I also think I think, Debbie, do you still have the New Jersey salary compensation report at a discount for center members?
Yes, we do. It's we have the old one, but we have one coming out. It'll probably come out hopefully by February or so. So which will be 2020 data.
Well, so, okay. It's thorough, it's good, it's state specific, y'all. And for those of us in the room who have the tough conversations, walk with that report and say, hey, I noticed for my position statewide, this is the range. And I wanted to have a little talk about how we can perhaps get there. So I think having those uncomfortable conversations are going to be really important. I see some awesome questions in the chat too that I want to lift up. Oh, maybe young audiences staff can answer. Margene wants to know, how similar are your efforts in this area to Art Horizons in Bergen County? Margene, do you mean efforts with regard to the arts programming or specifically with DEIA? And feel free to type it in the chat.
Actually, both.
Okay.
Actually, both.
Okay. Any insights from young audiences staff? Joe?
That's a good question. I am not super familiar with Arts Horizons efforts on the DEI side. I think we have a few other YA staff and trustees, so I'm curious if there is anyone who like feels more capable to speak to that in the moment.
Yeah, we'll see. Feel free to type it in the chat to Anna or Michelle. And I think that, oh, Debbie, thank you for that. I'm a big fan of the salary transparency with job postings. I've gotten in trouble for doing that in the past, but I regret nothing. I really do. Even put a range, y'all. Stop wasting people. Anyway.
And this is something, just to note that, Mikeala, this is something that that Young Audience is doing, right? In the last few years, we have salary transparency in our job postings, and we also had a lot of conversations about salary transparency internally and moved towards a similar model of currently we have for the staff internally transparent salary bands for different levels of positions.
Yeah, it helps take the mystery out of it, right? And I see Allison, my former neighbor friend, hey, says, how do you keep the momentum up? That's an excellent question, especially after, like, I really think it's interesting, especially as a person of color. People I hadn't talked to for years, y'all, last year, texting me, messaging, how are you doing? Ma'am, I haven't talked to you for years. What is going on? Oh, George Floyd, really? Really? Anyway, how do you keep the momentum up in a legitimate and fruitful way? I think it has to do with codifying. I think that having a conversation is good, but I would love to see more folks putting it in writing, whether that looks like, you know, for us, we function in committees. So we now have a committee that oversees that. Or if you're going to just make it something that is tied to budget items, I think, or naming a staff person who is going to be looking out for how diversity, equity, inclusion, etc. play out in your org. I think it's important. And I do think also leadership is key. And I don't want to put poor Michelle on the spot, but I do think if Michelle, who is our CEO, was not behind this, it wouldn't go very far. It would be something that's a pet project and it would die out. And so she has to really take a tough line, as does Anne, who's also in the room, with keeping it front of mind.
Yeah. I'll add something to that, Mikeala, which is, you know, I think that how to keep the momentum up really means different things for like where you're at as an organization, right? So if you're in a place, one of the hardest places to be in is if you're the person in your organization advocating for DEI work and everyone else is like, oh, sure, right? Or like maybe they were into it when the uprisings were happening, right? And there was all of that public pressure, but now they're less into it. I think one of the really key tools is think about the languages that work for the people in your organization, right? Especially for leadership, right? How are they thinking about value, right? Or if you're talking to, if you are in a leadership position and you're thinking about the rest of your staff, how are people thinking about value? How can you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion in terms of what they are already seeing value in, right? People will have their own personal relationships with how important this is, but if they see it's important for the organization, right, there is a business case here, right? Fundamentally, this makes business better, right? This makes the work that your organization does better. And if you can articulate that in the terms that the folks you're talking to will understand, right? In the CDP training, which is a little bit more corporate focused, this is return on investment, right? This is really talking in business terms to leadership about how fundamentally the bottom line is actually helped by diversity work.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. I also wanted to lift up Jessica's good question. So Jessica's from YWCA and says, how do we revamp our board? So specifically, you know, with diversity of high capacity members, as well as others who are perhaps younger or earlier in the career. She's going to be exploring whether or not men can join the YWCA board. And then you asked about just changing the board to a working board from not going to board shame here, but we all know there's some boards that are just letterhead boards, right? So I did put a plug in for my old buddy, Allison Howe. I do think that speaks to more governance work that you may need to look at. Like, what do your bylaws say about the function of the board, and just looking at best practice. I helped a friend who was in corporate actually do some board cleanup. It was so funny. And I was like, look at this, board source says this is their job. But you can totally say to them, this is best practice. Like, this is really what you should be doing, and then have a discussion. I think in terms of going back up to the first question though, when it comes to diversifying the board, I think that you have to have the candid conversation of, for example, if in the development budget, you expect X from the board, and you're going to bring people on that you're not sure can leverage that level of capacity from their own CAFAs, what will it look like? Will it look like you saying, hey, when you join our board, we're going to ask you to become a mini development officer. We're going to arm you with some language. We're going to ask you to be reaching out to people. And if you're not comfortable with that, then we may need to have some discussion. I'm a development person though, so I am biased. Like I think everybody should be a fundraiser, but that's my personal bias, I will name. But I think you should have that candid discussion up front about what cost, in quotes, you may have to having more diverse board members on. And I don't know if anyone else wants to add in the chat, just their own personal experience or what they've found that's worked.
I mean,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, this is Ann Betterton with Young Audiences. I use she, her pronouns. I mean, I am the staff liaison for the Committee on Trustees. And so we have had moments in time where we have had more diverse boards, but when we adopted this work and created a strategic plan around Arts United, we were almost 100% white board. And so that was actually like kind of fortuitous because it was incredibly motivating to people to be like, whoa, this cannot be, you know. And of course, as a staff member, I'm like, but no, it hasn't always been this way, you know, like wanting to, you know, go back into the history and all of that. But I resisted, and we just sort of sat in this space that was pretty alarming in the like level of whiteness. And so because we had put the strategic plan together, which was sort of staff led, it got really specific. And it said the board needs to, at a certain period of time, look this way. And then we put the goals of diversification of the board it's on every agenda of the Committee on Trustees. And so the language that we use in the strategic plan, and this, by the way, applies to all the agendas for all the committees, they all have Arts United is what we call our plan. They all have these Arts United goals living in the agendas. And so that is front and center all the time. And the staff know to be creating agendas with those goals. Those goals have to be discussed. We have to have movement on them. And we don't move in every meeting, but we move and we're aware of them and we do that. We also had a Committee on Trustees chair, who's still our chair, she's a white woman, but she completely understood and was totally bought into this process and sort of was like, I am personally going to make this happen. It was very personal for her to make this happen. And she's a lovely extrovert who is very engaging with people and was able to make that happen. But we also went back fully to our full board to try to shake the trees, to get folks, to our staff, to other people, and started to create networks that are kind of outside the norm of kind of business as usual. We're just going to go ahead and throw out names, et cetera. And part of that was a lot of discomfort around saying these terminologies out loud in meetings, right? So white women have a very hard time, in my experience, in these meetings being like, this person is a person of color, they're Black, they're African-American, or Latino or Latinx, or, you know, sexuality issues, or, you know, identity issues. There's a lot of kind of stumbling around in that's for some people incredibly uncomfortable. And we just were like, had to just process through that. So there was definitely a level of discomfort, and still is, in these conversations. But we have also, when we assess where we are and what we need, we actually created assessments for our board to fill out on their own and self-identify in all of these categories. And so that's also helpful because we're not speaking for anybody. We're letting everybody speak for themselves and self-identify.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Anne. I'm so glad you spoke up. I don't want to put you on the spot, but
yes, Anne.
No problem. You have the answers.
I'll move us back into the chat. We have a couple, another question from Matthew that I want to bring up. How do you mitigate the risk of offending / discomfort when addressing privilege with staff that belong to privileged identities? For example, white, cisgender, heteronormative, etc. This is a really good question. I think there's a lot of answers to that. I'm actually going to read another comment in the chat that I think connects a little bit, though it's about a board, which is Matthew says, other Matthew, different Matthew, don't get confused. My experience has been that my fear of losing or alienating board members was actually the biggest impediment. Once I worked through that, critical component. Once I worked through that and we started saying, this is who we are and this is what we believe, folks either got on board or they stepped back. And that actually has allowed us to feel closer to our own values and has accelerated us in a lot of ways. I do think that's a really key thing, right? If you're there, right? If the organization is there and there's enough buy-in at that point, just being like, this is upfront where we are, there is some element to which like folks kind of need to get on board or they don't. And like, if someone on the staff is getting on board in a like, this is part of my job, right? I just need to be on board. They can sort of be wherever they are in their personal life, right? While we do hope that people like buy into these values in a personal way, they don't actually need to do that fully in order to do their jobs, right? And making it clear that this is part of their job is to understand and to behave in a certain way that's in line with the values of the organization is key. Outside of that, I do think that there's, I am a person who holds multiple identities. I'm multiracial, I'm white and Asian. And so I often find myself in this sort of liaising place. So I do think that having consultants come in or having people who can speak from some element of understanding with folks holding those identities, right? Having the person who's the white, cisgender, hetero ally who really gets these things, be able to speak to those people, bringing in consultants or looking at reading resources that can speak to people with those identities can be really helpful, right? Often like being able to disarm that feeling of attack, I think that really comes with a reminder of like, that there is some way that this is not a personal attack, right? And that coming from someone with similar identities can sometimes be easier at the very beginning of this journey than it coming from someone who that person already feels really separated from, right? That can come a little bit later once they're unpacking some of those things. I'm peeking at the chat again.
Yeah, this is Michelle from YA. I just want to chime in and say, like, what Matthew number 2 said about sort of like stating the values and connecting back with mission, connecting back with why this is important for the students that we work with and the teachers we work with has been, I think, really critical for us to continue to not only do the work that needs to be done, that's the behind the scenes work, but the why is really important. And so that helps folks understand, what's the impact? Like, what is the difference for the child in the classroom for us? And that's really important to us, is that we, that's our responsibility there. So if we can continue to loop back to why this is important for our mission and for the work that we do, and totally true, they have an opportunity to get on board, and we give people multiple times to get on board. I know Joe has worked with artists over time who could not get on board. And even though he worked really collaboratively with them to, update their programs or change the way they were working, they couldn't get on board. And it was like, we did everything that we could. And so this is not we're not in alignment anymore. So, we'll go our separate ways. But I think that's been important to just hold the space for the collaboration and communication around it, but also the acknowledgement that like, this is where we are and you have opportunities to join us here. And if it's not what you're aligned with, then you are, we'll bless you and say, goodbye. So, and that's fine, because that makes us stronger and it lets that person go do work somewhere else where they do feel aligned.
That's right.
I love that, Michelle. And right, that gets a little bit back to this thing of speaking to people about the things that they value already, right? If someone is like, I am here on the board because I care about educating children, right? If you make it clear, this is a way that we educate children better, it's way easier to line up on that.
Yes. Joe, I want to lift up a couple comments in the chat. So Yvette says, what do you do when people are unclear of how they racially or ethnically identify? And I think somewhat related, Debbie observes there are invisible identities, LGBTQIA, disabilities like epilepsy, mental health, mixed race, hard to define. And I think for me, it comes back to grounding everyone in why it's relevant to identify at all. It's not just so we can check boxes and be like, oh, United Colors of Benetton. It really has to do with like, how might your lived or witnessed experiences, Adrian just taught us this week, help the work that we're doing? So for example, I have friends who they may identify as Chinese American in some spaces, but they also will lift up the fact that they sometimes have a proximity to whiteness that their Black or even South Asian allies or South Asian friends or colleagues rather may not have. What does that mean in the workplace? What does that mean in the financial world where you are trusted, but this other person of a darker skin hue isn't? I think similarly, when it comes to the hidden identities, it's important to name, like, what does it mean for someone to say, like, you know, when it comes to mental health, for example, easy to ignore, and to have someone who might choose to reveal that they have a mental health diagnosis will allow us to perhaps glean from them perspectives on how we do the work and ensure it's accessible to others with mental health diagnoses. So I think it's just about the relevance, but it is a sensitive thing because you don't want to foist anything on folks.
Yeah. I agree. And I think that, you know, it is really important to be careful of, like, in what public setting you're asking people to share, right? Like surveys that are anonymized, or that it's really clear how that data is being used, are really useful tools, because yeah, it can be really tender. I mean, even something like pronouns, right? Like, it's a really inclusive practice to be like, everyone share your pronouns. Some people maybe don't feel safe sharing their pronouns, especially if they're using non-binary pronouns, if they don't know the group they're in. So making sure that there's space for things to be private is really important. I had mentioned this to Yvette in the comments, but I just want to bump in one thing, and then we're going to do a super fast poll just to see sort of what you've gleaned from this session. I'm just shared in, I did it privately, but I will do it publicly now. I just want to share a connection to Dr. Yolanda Seeley Ruiz's work. She worked with us as part of our anti-racism programming initiative. Her work, Archaeology of Self, is really about starting this work from a place of understanding what is your personal identity and history, right? And that always sort of being the first step of really unpacking whether it's anti-racism, whether it's diversity, equity, inclusion, starting with yourself and understanding yourself is key, right? If you don't know who you are and where you're coming from and understand that clearly, it's really hard to get further in this work. So I highly recommend her as writer, speaker, consultant if you ever have need of someone for that. She's really wonderful. I'd like to move us into a quick poll. If anyone has further questions, feel free to put them into the Whova app. And I've already responded to a few things in there, but we'll be sure to, like, get in there and have conversations with you around questions if more come up. Natalia, if you are ready, I would love to launch that little poll. And while folks are looking at this, I'll just do a quick reminder, because I know we talked about the diversity development continuum a long time ago. So if you don't need this, just tune out my voice. But just to remind folks, compliant is EEO laws only, no diversity, equity, inclusion work. Conventional is baby steps. Purposeful is it's integrated, but still kind of soft data, still maybe not measuring very clearly. Competent is some further work, really measuring things in a really clear way. Advanced is thorough integration, right? We're looking at thorough integration, really clear measurements, this really approaching every aspect of the organization.
Nice. Poll results are coming in. We're at 52%. Hopefully everyone can quickly click. All right, we're hovering, we're inching up. Almost there. All right, I think we're hovering at 71%, maybe because those of us that are facilitating aren't taking the poll, which is fine. Should we close it?
Yeah, sounds good. All right, I'm going to close out the poll. So I believe you'll see results pop up on your screen in a second, just so you can sort of see who is in the room. Wonderful. I see that we see a range here. A lot of folks are in that purposeful place, which I think makes a lot of sense for the group that we have here today. So I think for those folks, right, because looking at the second one, we have a mix of a little strong and strong, a few not strong for how to keep moving along that continuum, right? Really think about what you're measuring. I think that's really my encouragement, right? How are you baking this into your plans? How are you making measurable goals? How are you doing baseline and end follow-up on those to see what you really accomplished, right? Which really takes your actions and turns them into impact that you can talk about in a more detailed way. what aspects of presentation is most useful to your work. Sounds like across the board, a lot of people had responses to everything. It sounds like the diversity development continuum and exploration of the trustee integration was really key for folks. This is really wonderful. Thank you all for this session. Thank you for sharing this with us. Again, on Whova, feel free to pop in questions for us there and we'll respond to them. I am happy to I'll leave you my email here in the chat in case you would like to connect further. Mikeala, anything else you want to say before we close out? I know we're just at that time.
I know we did pretty good, right, Debbie? I think everything you said is key. And also, as Anne and Michelle said, be willing to count the cost for those of us that are leaders. And I know Matthew F. said the same, just saying this is baked in and this is the direction we're headed. And if you really don't see yourself aligning, then, it's been a good run. So, yeah. Please do reach out via Whova or email. Happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mikeala. Thank you, Joe. It was incredibly interesting. Thank you so much. Oh, this is the real host. And the name is?
This is Seymour.
Hi, Seymour. Oh, you saved the best for the last.
Oh my God.
I'm sorry. This is the best part.
Oh, so sweet too. Because it's not like we saw their tail in the middle of the Zoom,
It's true.
We know about Zoom and cats. We know about Zoom and cats.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful session. Thank you. And feel free to put your question in Whova. I just want to thank everyone who attended this session. I put the link for our sponsors in the chat, so don't forget to visit the sponsors area. And also, I just want to tell you that this session is almost over, and I encourage you to move to the next session. So if anybody needs a link for this, I can also post it in the chat. 1 second, and it's in the chat. So you just I just cut and paste everything. You can go to the website or just click on the link I sent you. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalia. Bye, everybody. See you all later in Whova.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Am I the only one left on this party?